This is Faux-Authentic History.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Brian Young.
And I'm Holly Fry.
So today we're talking about the history of Florin and Guilder. And Florin and Guilder were two countries in a proto-version of Europe, and their exact locations in a modern-day sense aren't exactly known, but scholars have made guesses. And today we'll be talking about their storied history and just one of the many times they were on the brink of war.
And this time period that we're talking about in the history of these two particular nations is placed by historians as somewhere before the formation of Europe as we know it, but sometime after the creation of blue jeans, which Florinese scholars insist is a much older thing than modern reckoning would imply. So much of what we know about Florin and Guilder actually comes from the history tomes written by the Florinese writer S. Morgenstern, but that definitely shades our understanding of the Guilderians.
So Florin and Guilder were two countries set opposite a channel of water that those in Florin called the Florin Channel, and those in Guilder referred to as the Channel of Guilder. Sharks infested the channel, and there were many fishermen who used the channel for their livelihood. And the most direct route between the two countries was directly across the channel and up a sheer face of rock on the Guilderian side, 1,000 feet high, referred to as the Cliffs of Insanity. Few took that direct route, though most sailed for miles around and reached ports on the far side of the channel.
And it was said that both countries actually stayed alive by warring with each other over the centuries. So we know of a lot of these conflicts. The first of note was the Olive War. And then there was an oddly titled war called the Tuna Fish Discrepancy that was so costly that it practically left both nations completely bankrupt. And then after that, there was a conflict known as the Roman Rift, which finally did bankrupt both of those nations.
In the wake of that mutual bankruptcy, where neither nation could afford to war on the other, came a treaty called the Discord of the Emeralds, and both nations were able to replenish their riches by calling a truce and banding together to rob every other country within sailing distance of their mutual channel.
And according to the scholar Professor Bongiorno, the head of Columbia University's Florinese History Department, Florin fancied itself as a much more civilized country than Guilder over the years. But it was Guilder that was the superior country, and so this particular scholar based these findings in part on the superior quality of Guilder's female fashion, which, I mean, that's a good testament to a culture's advancement, in my opinion. Both in design and quality, it really surpassed the other. And so both countries were more or less wealthy, but the greater craftspeople were in Guilder.
So I wanted to note that we tried to get our hands on the original Florinese text of Morgenstern's manuscript to dive into this and a few other topics in this episode. The only thing we were able to access, though, is William Goldman's abridged version of the text. And that was frustrating for a few different reasons. For one, Goldman cuts pretty much anything an historian would want to research from the manuscript, and in the place of the historical context, he gloats about it in italics. In fact, Goldman says dismissively at one point in his version that he fully expected the leading Florinese scholars in America to slaughter him, but he doesn't care because he wants to tell a story by butchering Morgenstern's version.
So pretty much like all of academia today. But that story is also one of the most important stories in Florinese and Guilderian history, where war between the nations was going to be its most explosive. During this time, Princess Nerina was the heir to Guilder, and Prince Humperdink was the heir to Florin. And a match between them was proposed by Humperdink's aging father, King Lotharin, and Humperdink's stepmother, Queen Bella. And it was important to Lotharin, who was dying, that his son marry quickly and make a match that would make political sense and, all important, provide a male heir to the throne.
Queen Bella was sent to Guilder as an envoy in hopes of creating a match that would unite Florin and Guilder. There she would invite Princess Nerina to Florin to meet with Prince Humperdink for the day of annual celebration that commemorated the founding of Florin City, where King Lotharin's castle was located.
And it was during the feast, held in the Great Hall of Lotharin's castle, that the potential match between Humperdink and Nerina was to be decided. And it was said that at 8:23 that evening, there was every chance of a lasting alliance between the two nations. But at 8:24, the two nations were very close to war.
What went wrong in that 1 minute? Well, the wind, namely. When King Lotharin entered the Great Hall for dinner at 8:23, he arrived through the King's Door, which was situated on the east side of the room. In Florin, all King's Doors were situated on the east because the king was the closest person to the rising sun. When this door opened, it kicked up a strong crosswind between the main door and the King's Door, and that's when Princess Norina lost her hat.
So as it turns out, Princess Norina and Prince Humperdink were, in fact, getting along well enough, and this match seemed like a total success in the making. Everything was going really well, but when that wind kicked up and her hat blew off, everything changed. The fine Guilderian craftsmanship of that hat was, in fact, one of her secrets. She always wore hats because they disguised her wigs. And you see, Princess Norina was always wearing wigs because she was bald. And apparently a bald princess was infuriating to Humperdink.
So Humperdink stood up from the table and threatened her life immediately, and she fainted in her own humiliation. Her servants got her out of there quickly, and she was whisked immediately back home to Guilder. In the meantime, Humperdink vowed to conquer Guilder, but his father, the king, and mother, the queen, insisted the marriage be handled first. It was then that Humperdink suggested that they find any Florinese commoner they could for him to marry, as long as she was pretty and not bald.
Clearly the most important things in a mate. And that's when Humperdink's confidant and enforcer, the six-fingered Count Rugen, announced that he'd found the perfect girl on a Florinese farm. And for Humperdink, he wasn't interested in marriage, and his wife was really just going to be a tool of his revenge on Guilder anyway. But when Count Rugen brought him a milkmaid named Buttercup, who was the most beautiful girl in the whole world, he knew that she would work.
It took 3 years for the king and the rest of the nobles of Florin to figure out how to make the marriage of Buttercup to Humperdink legal, since she was not a princess. Royalty had to marry other royalty. So they found a small plot of land called Hammersmith, and they endowed this land to Buttercup and made her the princess of it, and gave her that title. So once this happened, the Princess Buttercup of Hammersmith came into being, and they spent the rest of the time training her to be a real princess in etiquette and things of that nature before revealing her to the people of Florin as Humperdink's bride.
So it was just after the king had turned 97, and 3 months exactly before the 500th anniversary of Florin, that Princess Buttercup of Hammersmith was finally debuted to the people of Florin. And over the years, they had heard stories of her overwhelming beauty, but when they finally saw her in person, they realized that in fact her beauty had been greatly underplayed. She was indeed the most beautiful creature in all of the world at that time.
And it was at the quincentennial that Buttercup and Humperdink were to be married, but Humperdink had hatched a revenge plot against Guilder, which had been set in motion already, and with any luck, there would be no wedding, merely a war.
Before the wedding could take place, there was this whole plot that was going to play out. 3 mercenaries had been hired to abduct the unwitting princess before the wedding, and then murder her and frame the people of Guilder for it, thereby offering Prince Humperdink the will of his people to smash Guilder and take it over for himself.
The first of these mercenaries was also the smartest and fancied himself their leader. His name was Vizzini, and he was a Sicilian. The second was a massive Turk named Fezzik, who was the largest man in all of Florin. The third was a Spaniard and one of the greatest living swordsmen. His name was Inigo Montoya.
So on one of the princess's evening rides, the 3 men stopped her, claiming that they were circus performers, and they asked her for help. But when she notified them that there was no one around for miles, they took that as a clear sign that it was in fact the right time to abduct her. They took some of the fine fabric from the uniform of a soldier of Guilder, and they placed it on the saddle of the princess's horse and then sent it back in the direction from which it had come, while they made off with Buttercup for themselves.
They opted to take the direct route to Guilder with their prisoner up the Cliffs of Insanity. And it was said that in the last century prior to this moment, only 2 had ever scaled the cliffs, so them opting to take this route with a prisoner against her will, no less, was quite a stunning choice.
And by this point, those assassins hired by the prince realized that they were being followed because they were seeing a man in black who started to scale the cliff behind them. This, of course, was the dread pirate Roberts, and he was going to steal the princess for himself for his own reasons. And it's important to note that piracy was in fact rampant at this time in the Florin Channel, but also everywhere in the world, and there was no pirate more dreaded than Roberts.
Roberts scaled the cliffs, bested the Spaniard, choked out the giant, and outwitted the Sicilian, and then took the princess for himself. Then, in an attempt to lose Prince Humperdink, an expert tracker, the dread pirate Roberts entered the fire swamp with the princess. And the fire swamp was a peculiar geographic oddity of the frontier between Guilder and Florin.
So yeah, fire swamps in general are a unique oddity, but this particular fire swamp was truly unique. In S. Morgenstern's text, he writes about standard fire swamps by saying, quote, "There are swamps which contain a large percentage of sulfur and other gas bubbles that burst continually into flame. They are covered with lush giant trees that shadow the ground, making the flame bursts seem particularly dramatic. Because they are dark, they are almost always quite moist, thereby attracting the standard insect and alligator community. In other words, a fire swamp is just a swamp, period. The rest is simply embroidery."
But he goes on to explain the odd characteristics of the Florin and Guilder fire swamp. First is the existence of snow sand, which is sometimes incorrectly identified as lightning sand. But where lightning sand is moist and basically destroys a person by drowning them, snow sand is like a powdery talcum, and that consistency, it kills a person by suffocation rather than drowning.
Yeah, I can't imagine a more horrible death than inhaling talcum. I mean, I'm sure they're out there, but at the moment, that sounds really awful. The other unusual feature of the fire swamp between Florin and Guilder was the presence of ROUSs, rodents of unusual size. These were a pure strain of carnivorous rat. They weighed about 80 pounds when they reached their full maturity. And Morgenstern described them as having the speed of wolfhounds and capable of going into deep frenzies.
It's important to note that this fire swamp was not the largest in the world at the time, no. That honor goes to Australia. The largest is a day's drive outside of Perth and is completely impenetrable. And at the time that the Florin and Guilder swamp was rated in such a way, the one in Australia was over 25 miles square, and the Florin and Guilder swamp was barely a third that size.
Just a tiny fire swamp, really. The children of Florin and Guilder were told of this fire swamp as a scary story, sort of a nice way to keep them in line. Parents in both countries would threaten misbehaving children with dropping them into the fire swamp and leaving them there. Even the Princess of Hammersmith was told this in her youth, and she had nightmares of dying in the swamp, which made her reluctant to go in with her captor.
But it turns out that the dread pirate Roberts was Buttercup's former farmhand, a boy named Wesley. When Buttercup was a teenager and a commoner, they had professed their undying love for each other, and Wesley sought his fortune across the sea. His ship was attacked by the dread pirate Roberts, and Wesley was taken prisoner. But the story returned home that he'd been killed. He explained to the princess that on the other side of the fire swamp was the mouth of Giant Eel Bay, and anchored in the deepest waters of that bay was his great ship, the Revenge.
She asked him if he knew Roberts, but he had to explain that he had actually inherited that title. The dread pirate Roberts was in fact a common pirate scheme. The originator of the name had retired 15 years prior and had then passed that to his second in command. And so in turn, then that man grew rich, retired, and then passed that name on until Wesley held the title.
Somehow, Wesley and the princess made it through the trials of the fire swamp and got within sight of Great Eel Bay. From the north sailed half the Florinese armada, from the south the other half, both halves closing in on the Revenge. Then on land, between the edge of the fire swamp and the bay, were 100 mounted horsemen led by the prince and Count Rugen.
Buttercup, of course not wanting her true love to be killed, bargained for Wesley's life. She asked that the prince not hurt him and set him free on his ship, and in return, they would surrender and she would marry the prince as planned. And at this point, she had no idea that her death was already ordered by the prince so that he could march on Guilder. Humperdink, of course, accepted the terms, but rather than release Wesley, the prince ordered Count Rugen to put him in what he called the Zoo of Death, which was his secret, subterranean, private zoo of animals to hunt.
It was 89 days between this point and the 500th anniversary of Florin, which was also when the wedding of Humperdink and Buttercup was still scheduled. This episode had served Humperdinck's thirst for war very well. The populace easily bought the story that agents of Guilder had organized the plot to kidnap the princess and had frayed the already strained relationship between the two countries because of the incident with Princess Nerina. This served to bolster his position as he plotted for the next phase in getting his country to rally against the Kingdom of Guilder when he finally called for war.
But Buttercup was not cooperative. She had determined to kill herself if she couldn't marry her Wesley, and she told the prince as much. He was disappointed, but he offered her another bargain. It had been a month since Wesley was allegedly set free. The prince would send his 4 fastest ships in each direction to find the revenge, since the dread pirate Roberts was never far from the shores of Florin, and if he still wanted Buttercup, she would be let out of their engagement. But if Wesley didn't come, she would agree to marry Humperdink and then become the Queen of Florin.
Now, he obviously was scheming here, as Wesley was still his prisoner in the Zoo of Death. He needed Buttercup, the beloved darling of the people of Florin, to marry him so that he could have her killed on their wedding night. He would blame the assassination on Guilder, and he would have his war. And after the bungling of the kidnapping on the Sicilians' part, Humperdink vowed to himself that he would strangle Buttercup to death personally.
What a delight. To begin laying the seeds of this plan, the prince called to his quarters in the castle a man named Yellin, the chief of all enforcement in Florin City. Humperdink told Yellin that spies had informed him that agents of Guilder were working to infiltrate Florin, and they'd been hiding in the thieves' quarter of Florin City. Humperdink ordered Yellin to empty that part of town and jail every undesirable in the name of security for his queen, reasoning that if they tried to kidnap her once, they would of course do it again.
On the eve of the wedding, the entire country was set on edge. Yellin had used his brute squad to clear the thieves' quarter, tension was high, and then from some unknown spot issued a scream that all could hear.
And what no one knew at the time was that that was the death scream of Wesley.
Now, how did Wesley die? By the night before the wedding, Buttercup had surmised that Humperdink had never actually sent those messages to the dread pirate Roberts. And she confronted him about this and reprofessed her love to Wesley and confidence that if there was a way Wesley could rescue her, he would, because love would win out. And this enraged Humperdink, and he left immediately to the Zoo of Death to murder Wesley by himself. To do it, he used a machine of Count Rugen's design that used suction cups to suck life from a person. And furious, the prince jacked the machine to its highest setting, and Wesley screamed until he died.
And with this, Humperdink was certain that his plans for war with Guilder were now secure. There would be no one to stop his wedding, and no one would guess that he was in fact planning on murdering his new bride himself.
The Spaniard, Inigo Montoya, and the Turk Fezzik, who had previously kidnapped Buttercup, heard the scream, and Montoya knew instinctively that it must have been the man in black who made the sound, since the Spaniard wanted revenge against Count Rugen for killing his father, and he didn't have the Sicilian to help him plan. He knew the only person smart enough to do that was the man who'd bested him. So with the giant at his side, they sought Wesley's body, found it in the Zoo of Death, and then they took that body to a miracle man.
So doctors and midwives were actually pretty common in Florin and Guilder. Both countries had a long history, however, of using miracle men for medicinal purposes. But this was a dying art, and Miracle Man was the last miracle man in the land, and he had been fired already by the royal family for not helping a nonagerian king get better from his ailments. So despite his ailments being old age and completely incurable, he was blamed and fired.
So Miracle Max was able to produce a miracle pill that brought Wesley, the dread pirate Roberts, back to life, but with none of his strength. The only asset he had left were his wits, but he would use the Spaniard and the giant as his hands to storm the castle before the wedding could take place. Humperdink could murder Buttercup, and the war with Guilder could continue.
As the wedding ceremony began, Wesley and the others created a ruse that cleared the guards from the main gate, disguising the giant in a Holocaust cloak they lit ablaze. And he shouted that he was the dread pirate Roberts coming for their souls, and there would be no survivors. And once they gained entrance to the castle, the giant carried the man in black to where he would be able to reunite with Buttercup, and the Spaniard confronted Count Rugen.
With the help of Buttercup, Wesley captured Prince Humperdink and tied him to a chair, leaving him and his compatriots to escape by stealing the prince's 4 white horses, taking Buttercup with them. Their escape effectively ended Humperdinck's ability to scapegoat the death of the princess on the country of Guilder, effectively ending the possibility of this specific war.
Although when two nations have conflicts named things like the Olive War and the Tuna Fish Discrepancy, it's very likely to say that they went to war after this particular exciting episode as well.
And that's what we're left with for the history of Florin and Guilder and the wars between them after William Goldman finished cutting everything.
Until we find some other piece of history.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll be able to learn more at some point.
That would be grand.
Yeah. So that's it for the history part. Yeah. So thank you all for coming. We hope you enjoyed this podcast and listen in the future and come see us at other stuff around the convention.